Hello everyone, and welcome back to a dev diary. This time it's going to be a TNO dev diary, which is not something I usually do, but there's this massive Italy diary that has just been released, which is kind of interesting, so we'll take a look at it very quickly. So, Development Diary 21, the country of cross destinies. Now, begins with a quote from Italo Calvino, who is one of the most famous Italian writers, essentially, of the period. And essentially, Italy in TNO looks something like this. As you may remember, actually, I don't have a TNO map up right now, but yeah, there's obviously, no Adriatic Sea, blah, 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 all that stuff. The islands are actually united a little bit, but that's basically the Italian Empire, except for, like, Egypt and East Africa, which also exist as part of the Italian Empire. It is mostly just, what you'd expect as continental Italy, a little bit of French territories, and a lot of the Balkans that have been incorporated into the Italian Empire, which is a legacy of Italian nationalist claims to the eastern half of the Adriatic Sea. And then, as you can see, they have an influence system where the French states in the Balkans and in the Mediterranean can be under Italian influence. And at the beginning, Algeria is a colony of Italy. Libya is obviously a colony of Italy, integral part of the Italian Empire. Greece is a puppet of Italy, and Croatia is a puppet of Italy. So that's that. So it goes into a little bit of detail into the backstory. It's a little bit different from our timeline in that the Italian army actually succeeds in taking over Africa and the Middle East from the British, blah, 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 blah. However, victory turns sour because the Germans dam the Mediterranean, and so they destroy the Italian economy. Then Mussolini dies, and he is replaced by his nephew, Gian Galeazzo Ciano, as you can see over here. And he is the leader at the beginning. The Italian starting situation, as you can see, the leader is Gian Galeazzo Ciano, who was in real life the foreign minister of Italy, and he pushed quite a bit during the war years for Italian exit from the war, because he did not believe that Italy was ready for a war, and he was, well, mostly correct. And eventually he was executed by, during the sort of German puppet state period in 1944, when the Italian kingdom had already switched sides to the Allies. But that's our timeline. It doesn't exist in this timeline. So he becomes the leader of Italy, and he becomes sort of this reformist kind of guy in internal policy, and in external policy he ends the alliance with Germans and has an alliance called the Triumvirate, an alliance between Italy, Turkey, and Iberia. Now, I don't have a map, which, world map. It would be kind of cool to have, so let's get it. So essentially, in the TNO world, as you can see, the Mediterranean is split between the Italian Empire, the Iberian Union, and Turkey. The German control of Africa is mostly limited to Central and Southern Sub-Saharan Africa, while the Italians and the Iberians dominate Northern Africa and the Middle East. The Kingdom of Egypt that's represented over here is also an Italian puppet state. The Italians also have colonies in Palestine and Jordan, and they control Kuwait, Oman, all that kind of stuff. Now, Turkey, Italy, and Iberia, because they were screwed over by Germany, have decided to band up and form an alliance called the Triumvirate, which means the Pact of Free Men. It's a reference from Roman history, where 2 times in the late Republican period, you had that power was shared between free men. Most famously, the first one was between Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. So these free guys share the Mediterranean. However, it's not really the best solution ever, because these free kind of always bicker with each other and try to, claim each other's territories, all that kind of stuff. But, for a while it coasts along. Then Mussolini dies in 1953. The new duce is Ciano, and now it's 1962. The vast Italian Empire is still as overstretched as it was since the end of the war. Unfortunately, the problems for the empire are not reserved for the external territories. The duce is far from an idealist or fanatic. On the contrary, he sees that the fascist political edifice has cracks running from the very foundations. Increasing popular dissent, gerontocracy, which means that essentially old people, there's not a generational renewal in leadership, so you mostly have extremely old people leading, and stagnation in the upper ranks of the PNF, which is the Partito Nazionale Fascista, the National Fascist Party. And the mismanaged empire might spell the end of Italy's short period as a world power. To amend some of these problems, the Duce has started to take a more liberal stance over the years, relaxing censorship, limiting the operations of the Ovra, which is the secret police, and so on. But Ciano knows that this isn't enough, and if Italy is to survive as a great power, everything has to change. So this is the Italosphere, the influence of the Italian Empire, which I'm guessing as an Italy player, your goal is going to be to expand that as much as possible throughout the Mediterranean. Then you have the beginning screen, the beginning situation. You have the leader description. Obviously, you can pause and read it. But essentially, it says the same things that we have been saying. And then you have the national spirits, which are declining trade, fading fascism, naval focus, and King Umberto II. Now, I'm not a big expert on Italian history, but I'll try to explain as much as possible to give a bit of context of what's going on. So, declining trade is really bad because, as it says, due to the damming of the Mediterranean, our trade has been permanently disabled due to us hardly being able to export resources outside the Mediterranean Sea because only the Suez Canal exists as a exit point through the Mediterranean. The Suez Canal is owned by Italy directly. But obviously Gibraltar is not around, and when you're, obviously going to be trading with England and Northern Europe, only having the Suez Canal considerably slows down the flow of trade, at least maritime trade, especially when you also consider trade with the United States of America, which is one of the only functioning economies in the TNO world. So yeah, not the best situation ever. Luckily, the triumvirate allows us to still make some profit and prevents our trade from being utterly annihilated, and the now Italian Suez Canal allows us to escape the Mediterranean. Now, this is pretty fucking bad, because the Italian economy, for a long time, actually, since the beginning of the century all the way to the 90s, was heavily reliant upon export, because you had a sort of dualistic economy. Italy has always traditionally kind of lagged behind the more advanced industrial economies of Germany, France, Belgium, Netherlands, England, and Sweden. But it wasn't without its industrial growth. A lot of it was pushed by state involvement in the economy. But the sort of big companies that were created from this involvement and were sort of helped pushed along in the first half of the century later became relatively competitive because of their involvement in the export market. Now, Italy had always had, because of its economic backwardness, lower wages than other countries. So its products had a lower labor cost, and thus it could produce them more cheaply for foreign markets. And industries that were more geared towards export could take advantage of this because the products weren't meant for Italians who had lower wages and thus lower spending, power, lower consumption, but for foreign markets. So, in the beginning, they were kind of encouraged to increase productivity because of the ability to export more cheaply. So Italy became kind of a China of Europe between the 1950s and the 1980s. Because it had lower labor costs, and so it could export more cheaply. And this was backed up by the monetary policy, which emphasized devaluation of the currency to make exports, again, cheaper and, driving down the costs. So much of today's Italian economy, which is a modern industrial consumption economy in part, is based upon this productive half of the economy, which was pushed along by the Italian economic miracle from from the end of the Second World War. In this timeline, much of this might not have happened, and the other half of the Italian economy, which is the vastly higher rate of small businesses compared to other countries, probably has more of an impact, or maybe not, because maybe they just all went under. Unfortunately, Italy has a very, very high percentage of small business, which is notoriously less competitive than bigger enterprises, except for some exceptions, and especially the realm of medium business. A lot of it is very uncompetitive and geared towards the the domestic market. But in 1962, the Italian domestic market probably isn't really all that big, so yeah, this is a big problem that they cannot trade. And this is going to get even worse, because it says the triumvirate allows us to still make some profit. Triumvirate dies very quickly. Fading fascism is just, the liberalization of society by Chano. Then you have Naval Focus, because Italy's armed forces were historically more geared towards the navy rather than the army. Understandably so, considering Italy's coastline and colonial designs. And then King Umberto II. Now, in real life, in our timeline, the Italian monarchy lasted from 1861 to 1948. Because in 1948, after the end of the Second World War, 1946. I was getting confused with another thing. In 1946, a referendum was held on whether or not Italy should become a republic or stay a kingdom. Now, the monarchy was viewed with, well, maybe not hatred, but definitely very, very deep dissatisfaction by most people because of its involvement in supporting the fascist regime. In 1922, the fascists had taken over essentially by pressuring the king to make Mussolini the prime minister. That began a sort of 7-year tenure as a sort of quote-unquote constitutional fascist government, and then in 1929 the full-on fascist dictatorship was established. And the monarchy had a big hand in that, and was a part of the whole ruling superstructure, ruling political structure. So Umberto II is the successor of Emmanuel III, and in real life he was the last king of Italy and only ruled for like a few months as king, because then the referendum voted in favor of the republic rather than the monarchy. So yeah, essentially the monarchy is that kind of thing. Now, in this timeline, the monarchy isn't tainted by the obvious support of a regime that drove Italy to catastrophic losses during the war. Instead, it is obviously a glorious institution of Italian imperial blah 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 blah. So not exactly the same. And you get a little bit of focus tree, which is what you get in the beginning. Now, as you can see, starts with the session 33 of the Grand Council. The Grand Council was the main body, leading body of the fascist dictatorship, the Grand Council of Fascism, and it included something like 20 people that would debate the major political issues facing the fascist party and the nation. The two paths that you can take at the beginning are either forza or sicurezza. Now, sicurezza means security, forza means strength, but it's also like a rallying cry. It's like, yeah, forza, let's go. So, continuing on with the reforms full speed ahead, or, sort of slowing down the reforms and staying with the order, which is going to influence the events later down the line a little bit, but not really in a decisive way. Then you get the Malta Conference, which is the first real foreign policy, event, which we're going to take a look at in a bit. So anyway, the Grand Council is essentially divided into two factions, as is the Fascist Party as a whole. One of them is a reformist faction supporting the Duce channel, and the other one supports Carlo Scorza, the second biggest in this timeline fascist leader. So he is the main rival, the secretary of the party, so, you know, obviously a very, very important guy. He has rallied around him a large swath of politicians, bureaucrats, generals, and other important names of the regime, all united by their opposition to the Duce's liberalizing attitudes. While Ciano's reforms may seem beneficial at first, Scorza argues that they will only harm the empire in the long run. Their tension in the party have grown to a climax in 1962. Fractures within the government are rising, and many are starting to believe that Ciano and Scorza will come to clash directly very soon. As debates start to rise regarding the stance that should be adopted towards puppet states and territories of the empire, deciding between Ciano's softer approach and Scorza's hardline stance will provide one of the two with a head start later on in the Verona conference over here, which we're going to take a look at in a bit. Now, the Malta Conference, I'm not going to go too deep into it. Essentially, like the triumvirate is trying to work out the differences between its members, because they're trying to oppose the German hegemony and quell the pains of the Atalantropa, which affects all Mediterranean countries. However, there are tensions rising in the world, and the different triumvirate nations are bickering with each other. So this multinational alliance is in big trouble because Iberia is like blah, 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 blah. You know, we don't like the other people. We want more territory in Africa. And Turkey is like, well, you're a dick, and we want Cyprus, Rhodes, the Dodecanesus, all these territories. If we take a look to the map, Turkey is which is in this timeline under a fascist government, has expanded quite a lot, you know, in the Caucasus and the Middle East, all that kind of stuff in Europe. But there are Italian colonies. This is Rhodes, the Dodecanesus, and probably, that looks like a city, but whatever, and Cyprus, and Crete, and obviously Libya. Obviously the Italian Middle East controls Damascus. There are a lot of Italian territories very close to Turkey. Now, Iberia's claims against Italy are more, you could say, posturing, like, you know, Italy is arrogant. Here they think that they're, you know, the Germany of the situation, all that kind of stuff. We want to be equal with them, and maybe we want some Africa as well, but, you know, the border disputes aren't really as important as between Italy and Turkey. Why are these border disputes with Turkey very important? Well, because these territories all over here, except for obviously Crete and Cyprus, which are gained from the British, but the Dodecanesus and Rhodes, which are these Hellenic islands over here in the Aegean Sea, as well as Libya, were taken by force by Italy from Turkey. Turkey used to control, you know, most of the Middle East. Egypt was taken by the British, and a lot of the Middle East was later taken by the British and the French after the First World War. But Libya, which was the farthest reach of the Ottoman Empire, and these Mediterranean possessions were taken by the Italians in the 1911 Italo-Turkish War. So Turkish people aren't really all that happy about that, especially with a, you know, revanchist fascist government. So yeah, essentially what you have is that in the Malta Conference, the Turks, you can pause and read it, the Turks and the Spanish, the Turks and the Iberians, which is a union between Spanish and Portugal, get together and make an alliance against the Italians. And so they're starting to essentially make the triumvirate crumble, but then it really, really goes wrong because there's like a bombing, terrorist attack, and so the whole thing, you know, explodes. Thankfully, none of the actual leaders are killed, but that's only because of luck. So tensions at this point are just skyrocketed, and the alliance falls apart. Now, this is kind of understandable because these are all kind of terrorist-loving nations. So yeah, that's pretty believable. Anyway, so yeah, basically the triumvirate is doomed from the start. On her own, the Empire of Italy is concerned with one thing, maintaining its sphere of influence. The failing states of Iberia and Turkey have decided to oppose the rightful claims of Italy in the shared bordering states. Now, I'm pretty sure that there's a war later on between Italy and Turkey over the Middle East. I'm not sure if there's going to be wars between Italy and Iberia, although Iberia obviously explodes, if you know. But yeah, that's basically it for the Triumvirate Alliance and the Mediterranean. And then you turn to the internal situation. So, as the Grand Council faces a divide between the two figures, the reformist Ciano and the reactionary conservative Scorza, the military unfortunately suffers similar yet even worse situation. Rivalry between fascists and the monarchists in the branches of service has led to bitter infighting and rivalry, while the two factions rally behind a leader. Now, this was the case historically as well. The fascist regime in Italy was, again, a compromise between, you know, the more traditional conservative and reactionary forces, you know, the monarchists, the conservatives, the hardline Catholics, and the, you know, straight-up fascists. And, you know, that leads to a lot of people also saying, well, some people also saying that some of the pre-takeover promises of fascism, of, you know, societal reform, welfare, all that kind of stuff are not really implemented because of that compromise with the monarchists and, you know, that need for social order or whatever, which, you know, comes to become important later. So, representing the fascists is the Black Prince, Giulio Valerio Borghese, a war hero, celebrity, and staunch supporter of fascism. With the success of the Regia Marina and most notably Borghese's Decima Flotilla Mass in the Second World War, Borghese was pushed into stardom across Italy, giving him a platform to expand his influence and ideals to the armed forces. Given his immense popularity and his connections to the PNF, he's not an easy man to touch. Now, this guy's relatively important in our timeline as well, because, as it says over here, he was the commander of the Decima Flotilla Mass, the 10th motorboat, that's what that acronym means, flotilla, which was at the beginning, like, kind of special force sort of unit, naval commando group that participated in actions in the Mediterranean with, again, like, light naval transport and commando tactics, and later on was an anti-partisan force that was involved in the repression of the Italian partisan movement during the Italian Social Republic, which obviously doesn't exist in the TNO timeline. The Italian Social Republic was a German puppet state between 1943 and 1945, established, you know, under the German army, and it was a republic rather than the fascist Italian kingdom that had preceded it. At that time, the Italian kingdom had you know, switched sides to the Allies, as I pointed out earlier. So later on, this motherfucker, as you can see, he's got an Iron Cross and the 10th unit patch on his shoulder from this photo. This motherfucker later on participates in the planning of a neo-fascist coup, which was kind of a farce, but, you know, made him, obviously, along with his war record, made him, like, the fascist, you know, poster boy. And, yeah, so this guy's relatively important in our timeline, very relatively, because after the end of the Second World War, fascism is really, really marginal in Italy, but very important in the TNO timeline. Leading the opposite faction is Edgardo Sogno, a monarchist with liberal tendencies. Already an influential man before the war with ties to the royal house, the victory under the monarchy alongside his service in the war gave him the chance to move across the fascist political game. Going from service to the war to a diplomatic career, Sogno is not an easy figure to avoid, as he still has numerous contacts in the armed forces. His popularity among the generals of the armed force only grew once he openly voiced support for Ciano's growing apathy in the fascist system. So let's take a look at him, so at least you have, like, you know, a face. There you are. And in real life, he actually participated in the partisan movement within, not, you know, the more left-wing, obviously, people, but in the more Catholic and militarist factions. Now, the Italian partisan movement in real life was most prominently, I guess, linked to socialist and communist left-wing politics. That is also the legacy, more or less, of the partisan anti-fascist movement. But it also had two other big components, which were the Catholics, under the Actionist Party, as they called it, the Catholic Action, and later the Christian Democracy, which becomes a relatively very important political party. And the third one was a monarchist, monarchist and militarist wing, nationalist wing, which was inspired to fight against the German occupation and the fascist puppet state in northern Italy by the secession from the Axis of southern Italy's monarchic regime and the official signing of the armistice in 1943 on the 8th of September 1943. So they viewed that this sort of right wing of the partisan movement viewed the continuation of the war on the fascist side as a kind of treachery to the Italian nation, because the Italian fascists were fighting on the side of the Germans that were at that moment occupying the country. At the same time, obviously, they were fighting along the Anglo-Americans who were themselves occupying the country, but whatever. And while the Catholic and left-wing partisans were more obviously, they were saying that they were fighting for either democracy or, you know, a better social system, a better world, obviously in the case of the communists. But it was obviously a more convincing line, but they didn't have pre-existing military units defecting to them generally, while the monarchists tended to be more represented again by dissenting military units that went into hiding and still fought as partisans. So you have this mechanic where you have the best of enemies. Since before World War II, the Italian armed forces have been split between a monarchist faction supporting the king and a fascist faction supporting Mussolini, so the Duce. And you can see that various branches of the army, and depending upon the paths, you're going to have that various different branches of the military support one leader or another. So you can see here there's the Regio Esercito, the Royal Army, the Regia Marina, the Royal Navy, the Regia Aeronautica, the Royal Air Force, the MVSN, which is the Milizie Volontarie per la Sicurezza Nazionale, voluntary militias for national security, who are more commonly known as the Black Shirts. We're going to meet them later. And the Carabinieri, who are the military police, the Carabiniers. Of these, obviously, only the Carabinieri still exist today because the Army, Navy, and Air Force are not royal anymore. But yeah, as you can see, depending on the path which Italy chooses to take, allowing an unfriendly faction to dominate the armed forces could have catastrophic results. So yeah, I'm guessing that this, as you can see, naval focus can be changed around into like Army dominance, Air Force dominance, Navy dominance, or Black Shirt dominance, and if that faction strongly favors someone that is opposed to what you're doing, to your political agenda, they're gonna coup you or something. So yeah, that sounds fun. That sounds pretty fun. Or maybe, terrorist attacks are gonna happen or something like that. So this also kind of represents, there's also a few events that, describe the situation, like, whose portrait should hang above the others, the kings or the leaders, the Royal Navy's name, and who needs to salute who, members of the royal family or admirals or that kind of stuff. So yeah, that basically represents the factional split, and you can influence, obviously by what you choose in the events, the way the factional struggle is going. This whole, if you do things wrong, you're gonna get couped, is rather representative of the political climate in Italy during the 60s and the 70s. So essentially, in our timeline in Italy, you had that after the end of fascism, you have a period of centrist political rule. Centrist political rule, which was mainly anchored on the political party called the Christian Democracy. And this party ruled at the beginning in a coalition with other centrist political parties like the Liberals, the Republicans, while later on, at the beginning in the 1960s, in 1960 itself, you have that the Christian Democracy, which was itself a big tent, so it had many, many currents, tendencies, and factions within it, started to split, and different parts of the Christian Democracy advocated for forming coalitions with either the socialists on the left, the more moderate left-wing party, to keep the communists out and to keep the right wing out, or the Christian Democracy conservative right wing to push for a compromise with the Italian social movement, which was the right wing, sort of neo-fascist, it's complicated kind of party. The attempt in 1960 by a government to make a coalition government with the right wing, extreme right, MSI, Italian Social Movement Party, caused, immense backlash, social unrest, that kind of stuff, people being killed by the police who were suppressing protests, cities being occupied almost. And so then a shift to the left happened, and the Christian Democratic left wing, led by a guy called Aldo Moro, who's going to become relatively important in the TNO timeline. We're gonna check him out later. Took over, and he and the left wing pushed for a compromise with the left wing socialists. But at that point, many members of the Italian armed forces, who were generally more right wing, more reactionary, more pro-American, while the socialists actually wanted to make Italy a neutral party in the European struggle of the Cold War, started to actively make plans for coupping the government and, preventing extreme left, blah, 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 blah. So there were many coup attempts. We saw, obviously Giulio Valerio Borghese, that, where the fuck is he? Where is he? Obviously, the fascist candidate. He in real life tried to make a neo-fascist coup, but there were other, attempts. So yeah, then you have the Italian nuclear program, which is called Progetto Alpha, which is an amazing little thing, Alpha Project. As the atomic age began with the utter obliteration in Pearl Harbor in 1945, which is what ends World War II in TNO, in the New Order. They nuke Pearl Harbor instead of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Italy quickly realized that to truly become a world power, achieving a nuclear arsenal was of utmost necessity, especially with crazy Germany to the north. But the Italian nuclear program, dubbed Progetto Alpha, is not an efficient one, understandably so. We've never been known for really efficiency, and Italy remains one of the former members of the Tripartite Pact not to possess nuclear weapons. The program has faced a lack of funding and resources, as well as a dire shortage in theoretical and practical knowledge on the production of nuclear weapons, and a lot of work is still needed before a successful test can be complete. But as the death throes of the Reich set Europe ablaze, because obviously Germany falls into civil war and all their puppet states start to erupt in conflict, it cannot be denied that the safety of nuclear deterrence would be invaluable to the Italian Empire. Also, it would probably ensure that Turkey and Iberia, and maybe the Americans, don't really make too many noises regarding Italy's sphere of influence. So here you get the decisions regarding the project, Progetto Alpha, really, really cool. So obviously, making making the Italian nuclear project a priority becomes relatively important. Now, it's important to know that in this timeline, since Mussolini got, you know, wasn't happy with the Germans, he actually rolled back the racial laws. Now, let's see. Yeah, ending racial laws and focusing on Jesus Christ. People want to voice chat. Later. Kinda busy. Alright. So yeah, you can have probably you can have Jewish scientists working for you. Like, I'm not sure if he's gonna be around, but Enrico Fermi, who is a very, very important Italian scientist who in real life had a lot to do with the Manhattan Project. He's been called the architect of the nuclear age and the architect of the atomic bomb because in 1938, 1939, because he had Jewish family members, he had Jewish quote-unquote blood, he had to flee from Italy to the United States because in 1938, not in 1922 when they took over, but in 1938, so 16 years after their takeover, the fascists enacted anti-Jewish laws. The Italian fascist racial doctrine was more focused on, like, blah, 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 the Italian Mediterranean white race against the barbaric African people, but you can enlighten them with the glorious Roman spirit or something like that, rather than, you know, let's see what your parents' blood is, blah, 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 blah. We're gonna calculate whether or not you need to be murdered and sterilized. That was the Nazi. That was the Nazi approach. So yeah, you can switch around different project leaders. Now, the leader is Edoardo Amaldi. I have no idea who he is, so let's take a look at that. Italian physicists, understandably. So probably you can switch these people around, and depending on which political faction you are, you're going to be more intransigent towards, you know, certain scientists because of their political or maybe racial background, and that might slow you. Because of your faction, you might have more nepotism and cronyism in the program. You might misallocate funds. You might be less, you know, you might be restricted in the amount of funds you push through because maybe your government is too pacifistic or something. In the end, however, it will be worth it, blah, 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 blah. And so probably when you play as Italy, you're going to be wanting to push this as much as possible, unless you're role-playing. With all the sappy introductions out of the way, the real meat for Italy comes in. Yeah, that was just the introduction. With rivalries in the PNF about to reach a boiling point and Scorza's faction becoming more and more powerful and threatening Ciano's rule, the Duce has decided that radical action is needed. A national congress of the fascist party will be held in Verona, a city in northern Italy. Yeah, I know. Here the Duce hopes to isolate Scorza, retaking control of the PNF and discrediting the upstart secretary once and for all. However, Scorza isn't going to Verona unprepared, leveraging his support in the party. The secretary hopes to turn the tables and deliver a killing blow to Ciano's rule in hopes of giving the position of Duce to someone more worthy, someone like Carlo Scorza himself. Yeah. We want to go back to real fascism or something. So yeah, you have debates on different issues. The first one is the Ministry of Popular Culture, which is analogous to the German Ministry of Propaganda, and as it is explained over here, this ministry was mired very much in the sort of typical Italian fascist inefficiency, cronyism, nepotism. Like, it was supposed to censor everything, you know, make everyone involved in the fascist cultural totalitarian project for the Italian life. A bit like the Volksgemeinschaft in Germany. It was supposed to get people in, you know, obviously like writers' unions, all that kind of stuff. But, you know, wasn't really all that effective. and it pushed along really like kind of derpy propaganda, and its name as well is, as it is explained, min culpop, kind of sounds like the Italian word for ours, which is culo. Min culpop, culo. You hear it. And obviously, you know, that's supposed to mean Ministero della Cultura Popolare. You know, it was a bit like, you know, what if Soviet and Nazi propaganda was a lot more cartoonish and less effective. I have a book actually in my house. It's actually my father's, but you know, I've read it about like fascist comics, and they were kind of hilarious actually. Really, really racist. So yeah, those were all pushed out by the Ministry of Popular Culture. So obviously, Ciano is trying to liberalize public discourse. Sorry, a bit like how you know, glasnost in the Soviet Union under Gorbachev, or whatchamacallit, or opening Kaifang in China had done. Well, Scorza wants to, you know, clamp down and tighten everything, tighten the control of everything, and, you know, make the bureaucracy more important, all that kind of stuff. Then you have the council vote. You can either approve Scorza or Ciano, and you know, that will put one candidate in favor or the other candidate in favor in the eyes of the Congress. Then you have the reform of the black shirts, the Milizia Volontaria per la Sicurezza Nazionale, as we have seen, one of the branches of the Italian armed forces. This was the political paramilitary of the fascist party, the paramilitary wing of the fascist party, which was, you know, during fascism reformed into something like the Waffen-SS, but it, you know, was still more militia than what the Waffen-SS later became as a sort of parallel military in Nazi Germany. So yeah, essentially, you have, as you can see, introduction to the debate. They have, you know, lots of powers, and what's kind of funny is that black shirts units are feared for their terror, including attacks on occasion, attacking on occasion American tourists, university students, and colonial subjects. So it's kind of funny. Apparently, there's American tourism in Italy, and the black shirts are just randomly beating them up, which is just the most appropriate thing I've seen written in all these things. It's just kind of like, yeah, I just want to visit where my fucking great uncle, you know, lived in Sicily or something. And then some fascist comes in and is like, degenerate American, I'm gonna beat you, or something like that. It's just absolutely representative of, like, you know, biting the hand that feeds you, that, you know, is relatively common in Italian culture sometimes. So, yeah, it's kind of funny. Anyway, Ciano's stance is that they should be downsized, and more role should be given over to the conventional military and the conventional police, while obviously Scorza's stance is that they should be strengthened and, you know, disciplined, regimented, all that kind of stuff. Then you have the council vote. Then you have trade unions. Now, trade unions was a relatively major subject of debate for the fascist movement. Some revolutionary syndicalists, so, you know, the people in Kaiserreich, you know, the people that are the substitutes for the communists, quite a few revolutionary syndicalists in Italy ended up supporting the Italian fascist movement, which is kind of horseshoe theory and kind of weird, ridiculous flip, but that's because, you know, the fascists were seen as more favorable of, you know, whatever the people's will was or whatever. And because the fascists advocated initially for a corporatist economic system, for class collaborationism, for integrating the trade union system with, you know, chambers of commerce, basically, into one organism that would be closely cooperating with the state to regulate the economy so that everyone could, you know, benefit, blah, 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 blah. A big part of this was that the trade unions had to be not independent, but state-controlled. Very, very important were, at the time, both and I mean at the time in the 1920s, both the socialist and communist-inspired trade union movement and the Catholic-inspired trade union movement. Now, the Catholic trade union movement sort of managed to survive for a long time, but the communist and socialist ones were targeted heavily by fascist repression and fascist attacks, both before the takeover and after the takeover. So before 1922 and after 1922. Like, strikes were broken up by, criminal gangs and collaborations with black shirts. These kinds of things, pro-union newspapers were burned. Their printing presses were burned by black shirt attacks, all that kind of stuff. So it was a really important part of the fascist social organization to have these state-controlled trade unions. This is the wrong thing. There we go. So, you can see that in 1939, you had the quote-unquote official establishment of the corporate state. As you can see over there, they're called the leggi fascistissime, which is a really fucking funny word, because it means like the really, really fascist laws. You can modify words in the Italian language to make them like, that's really like that. Like, bellissimo would be really beautiful, because bello means beautiful. Fascistissimo means really fascist. So it's really, really bombastic and kind of funny. It makes strikes illegal and further clamp down on workers' rights, because it was the fascist equivalent of like the Enabling Act in Germany, or the national security laws, I believe they were called in Japan. Just blah blah blah. You can't do anything. You need to mobilize everything for the state because we're in an emergency situation. You need to repress everything. And in 1939, you also have the official establishment of corporatism, but all that kind of stuff didn't really actually come around. As you can see, the trade union was set up as called the Confederazione Nazionale delle Corporazioni Sindacali, the National Confederation of Syndical Corporations. And everything else was integrated into that, but it was mostly a sham. A bit like the All-China Federation of Trade Unions today, the Chinese state trade union is a big sham, and was just a tool of collaboration between not the state, the worker, and the employer, but only between the state and the worker to oppress the worker. So Chano wants to reform this to allow sort of independent trade unions, while keep in mind that in post-war Italy, some big business actually supported the socialist and the communist parties' entry into the government, because they believed that the trade union movement could be turned into something akin to what happened in Britain. So not a movement that was explicitly against big business, but that was cooperating with big business to, ensure order in the factory, peace in the factory, social peace, ensure that wages would be adequate for the workers to increase productivity and increase consumption. And this would have, obviously had positive effects on the economy as a whole, reformist economics, New Deal economics. And so parts of big business like Fiat, like Eni, Fiat is the major car factory, and Eni is the state-owned petrol company, which becomes important also later on, were actually in favor of strengthening the trade union movement. They knew that, it would have hurt their profits in the short term because of the, pushes obviously for higher wages, but a more collaborative and friendly and strong trade union movement was preferable to, a more divided but with more hardline trade unionists. So parts of the economic establishment might be for more independent trade unions that could, do their job. In fact, even as recently as last year you had that the governor of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, he said that Italian trade unions are not doing their job, and Italian wages today are too low because the trade unions are not doing their job, and this is driving down consumption and slowing down the economic growth. Keep in mind that this is the governor of the European Central Bank, so he's not exactly, a communist guy. Scorza's stance is obviously that, you should control trade unions, all that kind of stuff, and reinforce corporatism. Finally, a radical proposal is being floated by some of the more radical members of the PNF's liberal wing, a change in Italian electoral laws. A very important aspect of the fascist political edifice. This is sure to spark fierce debate in the party. So, these are the Acerbo laws. They were introduced in the 20s by a politician called Giacomo Acerbo, and that's why they're called that. And they were only used once, as the event points out, in 1924. Now, since these laws gave a high called premio di maggioranza, supermajority prize. So essentially, if you get a little bit more than a certain quota of votes, you're going to get a lot of seats in parliament because you're the winner. So it's a bit first past the posty. The fascists had control. Now, this continued from 1924 to 1929, when, in that time, no new elections had been called. The government was still technically, a liberal democracy or whatever, but just, it was a coalition between the fascists and some right-wing liberals. In 1929, you have a plebiscite that confirms Mussolini's essentially, Mussolini's power grabs in the past few years, and is the official beginning of the fascist dictatorship. Before then, it was technically still, the fascist party was ruling, but it was still in the previous constitutional order. Now, this is actually quite anomalous, because the fascists, from 1922 to 1943, governed the country. Now, this is a long fucking time. Because in Italy we have had, I've just looked it up before beginning the video, we've had 130 governments in 158 years of existing as an independent country. So, except for these 20-something years of fascism, there's been a government each year, on average. Now, some of these were a few days, literally, of people trying to work out a government and then being this isn't working, and resigning. So maybe you have certain years in our political history where you had, 5 governments change, essentially. And then you have periods of, 2, 3, 4 years of government, of a single government, but we definitely have a different political culture from that of the United States, where it's every 4 years, blah, 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 and the only time this has been interrupted was, assassinations, or, Nixon, which was obviously, quite the extraordinary occasion with Watergate and that kind of stuff. Normal Italian political culture is extremely unstable. So these long fascist regimes are definitely the exception rather than the norm. So if fascism falls, this becomes, the question of electoral laws, blah, 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 becomes relatively important. Because you're probably going to have frequent events where the government has fallen because of someone said that your wife is a prostitute. So you have the final vote, which depends on, most likely, most likely you have that, depending on the paths that you have taken, and, maybe also how the military is feeling about everything, someone gets chosen, either Ciano or Scorza. Now, taking a look at the tree, you have Ciano's tree, and you have Scorza's tree, sorry. Fuck. That's the guy. Full tree. You have everything else? Yeah, the full tree. Can I see it? Yeah, there we go. So, what happens is that the Scorza tree is divided between two, the Second Verona Congress and Meet the New Duce, while Ciano has his first part. Ciano holds on, as you can see with a really cool picture, you know, those sunglasses. And then you have a big reformist sort of path that ends with Il Duce's democracy. So essentially what Ciano says is that, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, this shit ain't working. Fascism may be cool and all, but it's just not working. Let's just have elections so that, you know, more voices are represented, and then you have a democratic system. So we go down, where is it? The culmination of Ciano's efforts. Yeah, one last goodbye, the race begins. You have an election. Now, with the election, you have, Jesus Christ. With the elections, you have three main coalitions that are running, which we're going to explain later. And these, later on, have the democratic trees. Now, it's saying here are just a few, so it's probably going to be bigger than this, but yeah, let's go. So essentially what Ciano's trying to do is that he is trying to decrease the fascist party's influence on national life to allow more free expression, more, obviously, economic growth. So he has to sideline the fascist extremists and support fascist reformists. He has to, you know, sideline the radical left and support the moderate left, and he has to renew contact with the Catholic political movement, the political Catholicism movement, which was obviously very important and, well, still today is very important in Italian politics. So you get all this stuff, crack down on the Reds, national blocs, and then you have the Christian democracy, the Democratic Front. And so at that point, depending on all the choices that you've taken, you have the democracy, either, you know, probably more reformed or not. And then the you need to sort of destroy the Council of Fascism, the king's power, and push away again the extremist people. And you have to also reduce the personality cult of Mussolini. At the end, you have elections which are divided between three factions. Ciano, at this point, has retired from politics, and so he doesn't really, you know, involve himself all that much. You have the Blocchi Nazionali, the national blocs, which is a large right-wing tent coalition. Now, it's saying the former members of the PNF close to Ciano, so most likely the fascist party is actually outlawed or something, or dissolved. Now, in real life, the fascist party was outlawed following the destruction of the fascist regime, and so technically today it's still outlawed, although you have overtly neo-fascist organizations being around. And as you can see, the symbol of the Blocchi Nazionali over there is that little thing with a tricolor flame. It's a little bit hard to see. I wish I would have had a little bit of a better... yeah, you obviously have this real big description. For those longing for the good old days, you know, of purity and strength, a return to Italian greatness, blah, 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 blah. What exact... At the election beginning, if you could have imagined so soon a return of the fascists, but Almirante showed them a party that, while now kind, gentle, and forgiving, would still fight with all its strength for all it stands for. What exactly that was never clear, but the people nonetheless believed them. Now he rules the nation, and no one really knows what he intends to do with it. It's possible that the president himself doesn't know. Yeah, that's very Italian. Yeah, anyway, so that's the right-wingers. Essentially, they're made up of former fascist, nationalist, all that kind of people. Now, because of, again, fascism dying through reform rather than through a world war, they probably are a lot more influential than the right wing has been historically in Italy. Now, until the 1990s, you don't have straight up right wing government, except for that one little episode that I mentioned in 1960, which resulted in a lot of popular outrage and unrest. And only now you really have a lot of right-wing influence in Italian politics. Even in the 90s and early 2000s, it was still mostly center-right rather than right. Today, it's more right. But in this timeline, obviously, the right wing is a lot more influential because it's just come out of the fascist dictatorship. So, yeah, that's what the status quo is. So you have that the economic tree, they want to uphold corporatism. They want to, increase protectionism within the Italian economic sphere rather than linking up to the world economy. And they want to have welfare state to, again, blah, 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 the Italian worker, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end, I love it. Debt is natural. I fucking love that because it's kind of, it's known that Italy is one of the most indebted countries in the world. Now, a lot of this actually had to deal with the 1980s and 90s rather than the period between the 50s and the 70s and the early 80s that is going to be represented in TNO. Because at that time, essentially, spending and Italian economic policy was driven by currency devaluation. So you just printed money, inflation, currency devaluation, all that kind of stuff. Later on, when Italy joins the SME, as it's known in Italian, the Sistema Monetario Europeo, the European Monetary System, EMS, you have that all European currencies that join it, and later those get merged up into the euro, they essentially lose control over, value, and the banks are more and more centralized into the European Central Bank. So, gradually that kind of economic sovereignty is given over. So at that point, to finance public spending, what you have is that the state just has to indebt itself. So you have the public debt skyrockets, and today it's at something like 134% of GDP. So obviously really, really heavy. It seems like these guys managed to, indebt everything, which is just very, very Italian. In the political path, the right-wingers sort of steady the course and try to go back to, like blah, 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 tradition, glory of the Italian Empire, Mussolini, the church, all those things. The monarchy is cool. And, of course, fascism did nothing wrong, which is just amazing. You can also, you have a couple of things over here that are interesting. It seems like you can make the fascist regime come again. So essentially, you have an exclusive choice between the years of the sheep and the day of the lion. This comes from a Mussolini quote that essentially says, "It's better to live a day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep. È meglio vivere un giorno da leoni che 100 anni da pecora." So the years of the sheep is like, yeah, we're not fascist anymore, blah, 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 blah. We are definitely just right-wing, blah, 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 blah. And this either goes into the exploited and the exploiters or damn Reds, which I'm guessing is going to be either like, do we want to ally with big business or do we want to ally with, do we want to, have more populist rhetoric or something? With the Day of the Lion, it's like, nah, let's have a coup, which is what, again, was threatened a few times in real Italian politics. And I'm guessing that they can destroy democracy and then have a tree of, like, the new fascism or something. should they attempt to slide back into fascism, there will surely be unforeseen consequences, obviously. Now, this is very vague, but it along with the damn Reds, might imply that through this path, you can also have maybe a communist or far-left Italy, maybe, like, you know, yeah, let's make fascism again, and then it's like, oh no, everyone's revolting, and the Communist Party takes leadership or something. It would be kind of cool, because you cannot obviously elect them, because the far left, the quote-unquote far left, or center left more rather, is the Fronte Democratico, the Democratic Front. Now this is a coalition of left parties. Where is it? Yeah, hardline conservatives and nationalists. To the left, the Fronte Democratico, a somewhat controversial coalition of moderate left-wing politicians campaigning for social democracy, many of whom were exiled or forced into hiding by the Italian fascist regime. Now, it doesn't say which parties are around, but as you can see there's an Italian flag with a rose and a fist. So that's most, and that guy over there is Pietro Nenni, who in real life was a major politician of the Italian Socialist Party. So most likely it's the Italian Socialist Party, along with sort of Christian populist left-wing parties, such as the Action Party, which we briefly cited earlier, and some members maybe of the Christian Democratic left might want to cooperate with them, the left wing of the Christian Democrats. So, and maybe the Republicans or something. In Italy, you had a party called you actually still have. It's extremely small and, you know, a shadow of its former self, but you have a party called the Italian Republican Party, which was at the beginning a radical democratic party that wanted an Italian republic. Essentially, it was Mazzini's party, if you know that name. Yeah, essentially that. So they, you know, make reforms that are intended to, you know, keep the communists out, the fascists out, cooperate a little bit with the Christian Democrats, and make a glorious left wing. Now, the name Fronte Democratico is actually relatively similar to a real life thing, which was the Fronte Democratico Popolare, the Democratic People's Front, which was a alliance pact between the Socialist Party and the Communist Party that was formed from 1948, which was the date of the first elections of the Italian Republic, and ran all the way to 1956, I believe, which was you know, the Budapest uprising. And the Italian Communist Party supported the crackdown of the Soviet Union, saying, blah, 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 they're all CIA agents, kill them. And the socialists are like, you're fucking retarded, I'm out. And basically, that was the end of that. But, you know, they ran together in these elections for a few elections. And they had something like between 30 and 40% of the vote. So, you know, pretty big coalition. In this one, the communists aren't around, but because of the fascist regime being around a little bit longer, the communists probably, at this point, aren't as strong as they were in real life. So the socialists can probably rule on their own with the coalition, with a few minor parties. So yeah, then you have economic situation being of primary importance for them, because politically, they are like, yeah, blah, 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 democratization, okay. So you have either keep the banks or surrender the banks. Surrender the banks is like, probably, you know, don't bail them out. Don't bail them out. Break up a few of the big state, you know, monopolies, big state corporations. Increase their taxes, promote small businesses, support the unions, and then make a welfare state. Or you can be like, let's keep state capitalism, most likely is what this is, keep the banks, because a lot of these big businesses are state-owned, as we said. And then it's like, you know, exploit the Middle East and you revitalize the treasury, all that kind of stuff. Productivity battle, revitalize the industry, all that kind of stuff. So big, cool corporatist state capitalism with left-wing characteristics. So basically, China, which would be kind of great. And then you have the centers, the centrists, the Christian Democrats, the Catholics. So they are the, you could say, they're the people the most likely to win. They're the strongest. They're the favorites. So the Democrazia Cristiana is a centrist party, as we said, a centrist big tent party, a coalition of moderate Catholics, liberals, and centrists. And their tree is all about making compromises with both the socialists and the fascists to keep the social peace, the social order, revitalize education, as you see. And if you fail, I love it. It's like, hey, at least we tried, which is a bit of the attitude of the Italian governments towards education, historically, you could say. And then you have the social security campaign. You can either have, more welfare state or an embarrassing failure. So this is just continuing the legacy of Ciano-centrism and quite a bit of the path of what historical Italian leadership came to have. Now, probably if you collaborate with one side too much or the other, you might have some bad things happen. Like maybe, the leader over here, Aldo Moro, is the leader of the Christian democracy. In real life, he was kidnapped and killed. Now, he was kidnapped and killed during a phase called the Years of Lead, the Anni di Piombo. In the 70s, you have that a lot of the promised reforms that were pushed for in the 60s by a lot of social movements, mostly again focusing on trade unionism and student demonstrations. Obviously, very famous is the 1968 movement, which was also a thing in France and other European countries. Didn't really materialize. So you have that. Some of the participants of these movements become disillusioned and slide into terrorism. So they're like, blah, 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 there's no way normally to get these things done. Let's just kill them. Which is a very, very simplistic explanation of everything, but we don't have time to explain it more thoroughly. And so you have a few years, of terror attacks, and you have that the left-wingers generally targeted like business owners, lawyers, magistrates, mayors, representatives of authority. And you also have a right-wing terrorist movement that is more well known for big attacks, more along the lines of what you see today with jihadism, trying to make as many casualties as possible. Now, I live in Bologna, which is a city that it is kind of unlucky because it got like one of the last big attacks, which happened at the Bologna train station, and something like 30, 40 people died or something. I don't remember. I can't type. Let's see. How many people died? I don't remember. 85. And you can still see today, like you can see, just, they put a bomb there and made it explode. You can go today there, and you can still see a part of the wall that's like not rebuilt. And you can see, obviously, commemoration of the victims. Yeah, that one. You can still see a part of the wall, there as a commemoration. So, and you can see, as you can see over there, it's called Vittime del Terrorismo Fascista, victims of fascist terrorism. Now, this period of Italian politics was also when, there were all these rumors of coups and stuff like that, and conspiracy theories about this period abound. Also, you know, theories about like who was influencing who, what was the CIA doing, what was the KGB doing, all that kind of stuff. So probably if you fuck up with the stuff, you're gonna have some of this political thriller going on. You can also have a Scorza victory, which, as you can see, results in the Second Verona Congress, which is when essentially Scorza has... I'm going to do this really quickly because it's been going on for a long time, I know. So essentially Scorza is like gathering support also from some of the more disillusioned fascist people that are like, they held us back, they didn't allow us to do real fascism or something. And so you have these people convening a Second Verona Congress, and you can either shut it down with varying degrees of gentleness or, you know, hardline repression. So, you know, you can just punish everyone. And you do not see, actually, the big tree if it changes between what you do, but yeah. Or you can, you know, be progressively more reformist. So either murder everyone that wants reform, let's keep, you know, keep the course as steady as possible. Nothing to see here. It's like, you know, it's a bit Tiananmen Square-y. It's like, you know, blah, 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 nothing happened. Don't worry, everything's going on. Or you can have Viva il Duce, aka his personal dictatorship. It's like, yeah, you know, we can't do shit, but the Duce has to decide. Or eya la la, which was a fascist sort of rallying cry, really kind of bombastic, derpy things, which is coming from the spirit of Fiume. Now, this comes from the really early beginnings of the radical nationalist Italian movement. Now, the Impresa di Fiume, the Fiume enterprise, the Fiume, you know, Fiume attempt, essentially was when a bunch of Italian nationalists occupied a town that had been given over to the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which later on became Yugoslavia. And a bunch of these nationalists went in there and occupied this town and said, hey, this town is Italian, blah, blah, blah. This town was really majority Italian, but whatever. That's not the point. The point is, this enterprise is seen by radical nationalists as, you know, this first, like, big irredentist, pan-nationalist, and revisionist also, because it was against the established diplomatic, you know, end of the First World War, against the treaties. It was this first action to espouse these ideals, and later on, a few of the participants became prominent fascists. Now, a lot of the participants actually were, you could say, quote-unquote, social activists as well. They had the idea that the Italian state had failed in protecting the Italian people. So they had also this kind of populist, syndicalist element that you can see over there. For example, one of these participants is Alceste de Ambris, who at the beginning was a socialist, a syndicalist revolutionary. So, yeah. At that point, essentially, fascism, which was still in its infancy, had a quote-unquote left-wing, syndicalist, anti-bourgeois, anti-church, anti-monarchy ideology. A bit like how there were Strasserists in Germany. But obviously later on, this tendency is eradicated. And in fact, this sort of rogue state that they established in this little town in the middle, in the Yugoslav coast, essentially was the first state to ever recognize the Soviet Union. So it was this kind of derpy thing. It's like, yeah, look at that, the Soviet Union's doing the revolution. Cool. That's kind of what they thought. It doesn't matter that they're like commies or whatever. So at that point, this movement was still not nearly as well formed in its ideology as it later on became. So you can try to revive this spirit a little bit. In fact, later on, when you meet the new Duce, you have a few choices that you're taking. I'm guessing that this is the reformist tree, but who knows? Either dealing with the Vatican, well, no, in free camps, dealing with the Vatican, these are all social issues, dealing with the youth, and dealing with the status of women. You can have syndicalist, feminist, and, radical, futurist fascism, okay? So yeah, fully automated luxury gay space fascism. And this is reflecting kind of this weird-ass dichotomy of early fascism. Now, this is relatively memey. There's absolutely no chance that any of this sort of socially progressive ideology would ever make it into fascism, considering the turn it later took in history. But, it's a cool historical little thing. You can turn it around because, again, Scorza's trying to win new support. He's trying to change things up while maintaining the fascist order. So, you can make fully luxury gay space fascism. Again, exalt youthfulness, individual spirit, free ideas, and the woman making herself known in society. This initiativism that was very heavily part of the avant-garde futurism and some of the early fascist ideology, which later only became like, oh yeah, you should like be strong and show initiative, but like to make the fascist empire, you should be, the soldier that's the first, with a knife in your hand assaulting the enemy, but you should also listen to authority or something. So the dealing with the Vatican is either like a secular society or the Concordat. Now, the Concordat is a part of an agreement between the Italian state and the church known as the Lateranensian Pax, Patti Lateranensi, which was in 1927. In 1927, Mussolini got together with the Pope to resolve what was called the Roman question. From 1871, which was when the Italian kingdom forcibly annexed the Papal State, which at the time was still a state, and controlled a lot of central Italy. From 1871 to again 1927, when they made the agreement with Mussolini, the Vatican was very hostile to the Italian state, actually, and sort of tried to prohibit Catholics from participating in public politics. It was called non exieris, I believe, in Latin. I'm pretty sure it was this one, which was, well, fucking murder yourself. Let's get this shit cleared up. What was it called? Essentially, the Pope said, like, nah, you guys are not going to vote, you guys are not going to make political... Non-expedit, sorry. It's not convenient, it's not, it's not... I can't speak. So yeah, basically they told everyone not to participate in elections, blah, 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 and they kind of segregated themselves in their, in the Vatican, refusing to collaborate with the government. And so that was obviously a source of a lot of social instability because of the influence that the Catholic Church had within the Italian society. And later on, later on there was a bit of a détente, but none of this had really been legally resolved between the church and the Italian state until, again, apparently it was in 1929. It was the Lateran-Anzian Pax. I'm sorry, I thought it was 1927. It wasn't until 1929 that this was solved with the so-called Pax, the Lateran-Anzian Pax, which are made up of the Concordat and a few other agreements, which made the Catholic religion the state religion, officially, 100%. It established that some Catholic organizations could work despite, technically being banned by the fascist regime, so that, along with the fascist party, there was also the Catholic Church in society. And it established, I think, some kind of economic agreement for, like, reparations of damages, all that kind of stuff. And it also established the Vatican state, the Vatican city-state. Until then, the Vatican, between 1871 and 1929, did not technically have a state. But from then on, it was allowed to rejoin the family of nations as the, city of the Vatican or something in Rome. And, the Vatican City and Italy mutually recognized and, guaranteed each other's independence. And, there were a few other privileges given over to the Catholic Church, all that kind of stuff. Now, I have my history book over here, and I've actually read a few things to prepare. And there's actually this kind of relatively interesting primary source that's cited on fascist ideology and attitude towards Catholicism. Now, if I can find it, it would be great. It would be pretty cool. Yeah, there we go. So essentially, like, historically, the fascist attitude towards the church, while at the beginning was relatively influenced by anti-clerical and anti-clerical ideology of, religion and the church being blah 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 of the past, and we should have a secular state, and we should only care about the nation and not about the church. In reality, Mussolini turned into, a more traditionalist, orthodox, let's cooperate with the church. Also because with the fascist idea of the state as a sort of all-encompassing ideal that everyone should work towards, strengthening and holding and upholding, you have the logical conclusion that that state, if it wants to function in society, especially in a society that is so heavily influenced by the church and religious ideology, has to at least collaborate, if not incorporate religion, rather than separate it. Because if you're incorporating, for example, trade unions into the state, and if you're incorporating chambers of commerce into the state, then you also need to, and if you're expanding the role of the state to an individual's private life, then you also need to incorporate the church. So yeah, there's that. And so yeah, that's basically all that. And this is the end. At the end, it's like, Italy's best days are not behind it but ahead. With great effort and everyone's persistence, Italy may change for the better and become the empire it was meant to be. The Italian Empire is like a play. The stage is the Mediterranean Sea, and like all plays, it has many actors. Now, this image is really cool because it shows, some of the main political actors that you're going to see, and I'm guessing a few of these can actually be leaders. So you have the royals, obviously, on the right side. These are the members of the Royal House of Savoy. There's Umberto II, there's Amedeo, there's Tomislav, there's Margherita, and Adalberto. Now, Tomislav is the king of Croatia. Now, this guy, unlike the name is fucking hell. Now, I sure hope that there is a disambiguation, because Jesus fucking Christ. This is the rules of Croatia. Independent state of Croatia. There we go. Tomislav II. This guy was actually Italian. Prince Aimone. Now, yeah, here it's represented as like, it's like saying, Tomislav, this guy's not actually Croatian. This guy is an Italian. He's a member of the, the Savoy, House of Savoy royal family. So, yeah, kind of an interesting little thing. He was the first leader of the Croatian, first head of state of the Croatian puppet independent state of Croatia, or maybe not the first head of state, but definitely one of the big ones. And at some point, he decided to abdicate, and the independent state of Croatia, was only ruled by Ante Pavelic. So yeah, that's kind of interesting little thing. Now, the politicians and the generals. I like how there's Italia primo atto, press start. This is only apparently quote unquote the primo atto, the first act. So it's a bit like quote unquote a play. And the quote is, "Governing Italians isn't difficult; it's just pointless." Now, I'm not sure if this is a real quote. Who is? Oh, apparently it's Mussolini's quote. So, governare gli italiani non è difficile, è inutile. Governing Italians isn't difficult, it's just pointless. So yeah, here's the main ones. Obviously, you see Galeazzo Ciano, who is the leader at the beginning, the heir of Mussolini. Carlo Scorza is the pretender to the title of Duce. Enrico Mattei is the oil king, which is really nice. Really nice, because he was the administrator, the CEO of the major Italian state-owned oil company Eni. Then you have Giorgio Almirante, the underdog, the little right-wing fascist guy that gets elected. Amintore Fanfani, who in real life was a sort of moderate politician, mostly known for some of his economic policies. Then you have an unknown guy known as the Aviator. Now, I'm pretty sure that this guy is, where the fuck is it? I'm pretty sure that this guy is Italo Balbo, who in real life was killed during the war, but in here he might not have. You can see he kind of looks like that, and he's old, because at this point he'd be old, and he's the Aviator. Italo Balbo was known mostly as an aviator. And chief of the Air Force. Then you have Aldo Moro, the compromiser. Giuseppe Saragat, the moderate. He was a moderate left-wing politician. He was a socialist, member of the Socialist Party, but he was pro-Atlantic, pro-American. And he participated in a few coalition governments with the left-wing Christian Democracy. Then you have Enrico Cerulli, the scholar. Pietro Nenni, the reformist, the leader of the Italian Socialist. Then you have a Grey Eminence guy, who I believe, at the beginning I thought it would have been Enrico Mattei, but actually I don't think I know who he is. Now, he looks old, so if you have any ideas, do tell. Then you have a guy called Giorgio Rappanelli as the adventurer. I have no idea who he could be. And then you have, obviously, the generals. Now, the problem solver is relatively important, because it's this guy, Giovanni Di Lorenzo. As you can see, he's got a cool monocle, which tells you he's a cool guy. And you can see this is the pic where he mostly resembles the guy in the photo, the problem solver. In real life, he was involved in one of those coup attempts that I talked about, and he was later on a prominent sort of neo-fascist, extreme right-wing politician, and he was also leader of the. Well, I'm not sure if he was completely the leader, but he was one of the major players within the SIFAR, Servizio Informazioni Forze Armate, which was sort of the first secret service the Italian Republic. Now, I'd really, really love to know who the fuck the Grey Eminence was, and I would also really fucking love to know who the Butcher is. Now, they haven't grayed out his face, which, like, I thought that there's a very, 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 very slight chance that it's a guy called Rodolfo Graziani. Now, this guy was infamous. Like, what tells me that he could be him is that it's the Butcher. Like, this guy was known as essentially the Butcher of Libya and of Ethiopia. He employed some extremely cruel, extremely harsh tactics to pacify Italy's colonies. And he was, you know, a field marshal of the Italian army. One of the major, essentially, war criminals of fascist Italy. And now he died in 1955. So technically, in 1962, he's not supposed to be around. But I don't know. He might be alive or something. Like, and then at the end, he was a prominent right-wing guy, obviously. I don't know. He might still be around because the Butcher, it's definitely him. And he relatively looks like him. Sort of. I mean, not exactly 100%, but I don't know. It's possible. He looks definitely like someone who's in Africa, and he looks pretty old. So it might be him. Otherwise, I have absolutely no idea. Absolutely no idea who he is. So, what makes me think that maybe it's possible is that where is it? It's that he was born in 1882. So he'd be something like 80 years old at this point. Not impossible. Not impossible. And then you have the Schemer. Now, the Schemer is really, really bad. Really, really, really bad. I will preface it by saying that I do not know who he is because I couldn't find any pictures of really cool people with pipes. But I have an idea because he has this P2 box around him. Now, that's really bad. Why? Because what is P2? P2 is a Masonic lodge that was associated with a lot of right-wing governments around Europe and South America, especially though in Italy. It was an Italian, it was something that was born in Italy. And it was sometimes referred to as a state within a state or a shadow government. It essentially played a part in a lot of those political tensions and intrigues and coup attempts, schemes, all that kind of stuff that I talked about during this whole diary. So, yeah, it's just not fun. And the leader was a guy called Licio Gelli. Might be him. Who knows? Doesn't have any facial hair. And they barred out his face, so we do not know if he has glasses or anything. I couldn't find any pictures of him with a pipe, so I do not know. But this guy was a financier, essentially. And he was also a fascist. So, yeah, if things go extremely wrong, the schemes might come. Maybe in the second act of the play, who knows. So yeah, and what makes this organization really, really scary is that it had connections to a lot of prominent Italian politicians on essentially all parts of the political spectrum, except really the Italian Communist Party, although they were involved as well. And when all of this was uncovered, essentially everything exploded. Like, it was a rotten edifice, and because like these guys were bribing and scheming behind the back of the political establishment, but you know, all the parties were involved. So when this corruption scandal hit called Mani Pulite, Clean Hands, that essentially discovered all of this shit, it was just a mess. Like, the whole political system essentially, you know, ended. In fact, political commentators use the term First Republic to refer to everything from 1946 to 1994, I believe. 1994, I believe that was the year. No, 1992, the year of the scandal. And then after that, it's the Second Republic, just representing this sort of radical shift of personnel that had to be, personnel and parties that had to be essentially affected to give any legitimacy to the political system. Now, the parties sort of stayed relatively similar, except for the splintering of the Christian Democrats. Like, the Italian communists and the Italian socialists merged to form the left-wing, the moderate left-wing parties that we know today in Italy. And part of the Christian democracy left-wing came into those as well. And then the right-wing was reformed by, obviously, Silvio Berlusconi, who was a relatively well-known guy, and that got, you know, a lot of the Christian democratic center and right-wing, and a lot of the farther right support. And, yeah, I'm really, really interested to see what's going to go on with the scheming, because it's really, really not the best. It's not the greatest. Now, he's also, quote-unquote, a general, which should tell me that it isn't this guy, but who knows? He was a volunteer in 1941. He, you know, he participated in the Italian war effort. So who knows? Who the fuck knows? So yeah, I want to thank you all for watching this ridiculously long dev diary, which was an hour and 41 minutes. Jesus fucking Christ. And I hope you've enjoyed. I'll see you soon.